We are live. Give people a second here. Welcome to Composer Notes episode 4, I believe this is. And today we are going to be talking about my piece Spark. So Spark has actually got kind of an interesting background story, and it's one of my favorite pieces to begin with, but there's a lot to it. So let me kind of give a quick little background here about it. So in 2008, 2009, I had just started college, and I had just started writing also my first symphony. I spent a year's worth of work working on it, and I got about, I think, 3 movements done. And then, excuse me, at the beginning of 2009, the hard drive that all the work was on just died, and I couldn't recover it. This was the closest I think I've ever come personally to giving up on composing. I was just absolutely devastated about it, and I thought the work was lost forever. Fast forward to 2013, and I'm starting to wrap up my last year in college, and my parents had happened to give me a box of stuff that they said they wanted me to kind of sort out over Christmas break, and so I started digging through it, and there was a bunch of scores in there. I was like, oh, let me look at these quick, see if there's anything good or worth saving. And in those scores happened to be a printout of my first 3 movements of the symphony. I don't think I had ever been so excited. So I was so excited finding these things that I decided, I was like, I'm going to try to salvage this. I'm going to try to, I wasn't really fully committed yet to rewriting the work from scratch yet. But I decided to take my favorite material from those 3 movements and combine them into one piece, and I called it Spark. So I started writing it, and I didn't touch it for almost a full year. During that time, I graduated, I moved to Kansas City, got married to my beautiful wife, Ariane, and it wasn't until later she just happened to ask me what happened to that piece that I was working on. At that point, it kind of just slipped my mind. I had a lot of life events that started all at the same time, and so I decided to work on it again, and I worked on it again on and off for a few months, just polishing it up and getting it ready to go. So fast forward to mid-2015, I decided to submit it to the Claude T. Smith Memorial Composition Contest. At this point, I really only had a rough MIDI render of the piece, but I still decided to enter it. Fast forward to that September, I'm eating dinner with my wife on a Sunday night, and I get a phone call from Warrensburg, Missouri. I was really confused about that. And on the other end of the line was Dr. Russ Coleman, telling me that I had won the contest. I was absolutely thrilled and honored that I had been selected as a winner, and it was really unusual because I won on a MIDI. So the agreement was that Clayton High School Symphonic Band was going to premiere it, but I had to cut it down to a 3-minute version of it. So I got that done in about a week. Clayton approved it. That's simply because MMEA has these really weird time restrictions on performances. You can't go over X amount of minutes of material, otherwise you get penalized. Anyway, long story short, they premiered the shortened version of Spark January of that year, and then February of that year, the St. Louis Wind Symphony, under the conducting of Tom Poshak, premiered the full 5-minute full version of Spark, and it was published later that year with Grand Mason Music. So let's kind of get into the piece and talk about some general tips. So the performance that we're using today is from Dr. Jonathan Sweet and the Purdue Symphonic Band. This performance was one of the ones that made my jaw drop to the floor. It was so good. So here's some tips from him directly. He says to always keep a steady tempo. I agree. That's really, really important for this piece. There's a lot of meter changes. You want to make sure that 8th note is always your constant pulse. Always let the French horns rip at the end. We'll get to that. And he also says pace the hell out of the piece. Don't get loud too soon. Save it for the end. All things I thoroughly agree with. This is coming from someone who's conducted a performance of it, and he knows this piece just as bad as well as I do. So let's get into some of the performance here. So I'm going to just play the first 4 bars here. Okay, so right at the beginning, there's a 6-note motive, and that 6-note motive becomes the basis of the entire piece. So that 6-note motive was originally from Spark of Life, from the symphony. So a lot of people have this tendency on this 9/8 measure to hold it like a fermata. Don't hold it like a fermata. actually treat it like a true 9/8 measure, even though nobody is playing anything in here at all. On measure 4, this 8th note is meant to be kind of in an awkward beat. So it's kind of like surprises and catches the audience off guard because they're really expecting it to resolve down. But it never, like there is no resolution to the previous measure. It's just this really awkwardly placed 8th note. I would suggest just cueing this. Don't put it right down on the beat, but slightly off. All right, let's listen to the next section here. All right, so in this section, we have the first true introductory of the full motive statement and material. You, as a conductor, have to really lock in tempo with your marimba. The marimba is the constant driving factor for a majority of this piece. So really make sure that, that based on where they're placed, whatever, that you constantly have a constant eye contact and that you're able to really keep a steady tempo with them. The chime part here, very, very important. We bring them back a little bit later, but really let them ring out through that section. Excuse me. So for the brushes on the snare drum, I would recommend wire brushes, or there's also a style brush called dreadlocks. They have a lot more bristles on them, and so they can kind of create more of a staticky kind of like swirling effect. Either of those are perfectly fine. Whatever you have and your percussionist has should work fine. So let's go ahead and listen to this next section here. Okay, so in this section here, we're going from a constant 6/8, 3/4, and I decided to just go ahead and throw some 7/8 and 8/8 in there for good measure. I originally had this written as 6/8 plus 3/4, but decided just to kind of throw a little curveball in there to see A, if you're paying attention, and B, it adds something a little bit different, adds a little flair to the motive that wasn't really heard before. So once again, just as long as you're keeping that 8th note pattern, it should be very simple. It might catch your group off guard the first time they play through it, but it'll be fine afterwards. So let's go ahead and listen to this next section up here. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. So, a couple important things to note here. If your trombones do not have all harmony mutes, cut mutes work perfectly fine for this section. Do not start this gliss until that 8th note. Let me zoom in here. So start that gliss right on that 8th note, so like delay it as long as possible. That way it sounds really quick and dirty, and the first trombone is covering a lot of ground here as well. That'll help really bring out that effect, and it'll really help accentuate the dynamic there. So during this section also, we are building up to our first big hit point in the piece, and the thing that I can't overemphasize here is that do not let it build up too fast. There's a lot of piece still left, and while we are building up to a big moment in the piece, it shouldn't be the biggest moment. So make sure that you really rein that in and temper the expectations leading up into rehearsal F. So let's listen to rehearsal F. Alright, stop it right there before one of my favorite parts of the whole piece. Just general tips for this section right here. If you guys have the main motive in the piece, so trumpets, clarinets, flutes, bring that out. The horns, the trombones, and the low brass are kind of having these supportive ideas as well, but they're not meant to be the predominant idea. On the subito mezzo piano, really, really bring that out. We're going from a pretty loud statement to a really, really soft statement, and it's going to really help make this next section really come out of nowhere, which is what I really wanted. So let's listen to this next big section up to the fermata. So this is rehearsal G to the fermata. Okay, so this is one of my favorite things I think I've written ever, to be fair. So, horns. This is, I write bring out, and I really want you to bring it out. There's no one else here that's really playing this idea. So, this idea comes back later on in the piece. You are so important here. So you need to make sure that you're not only playing with a very good tone, but that you can also be heard over everybody else. But you don't want it to be the loudest thing that you play in the piece. So you have to find a pretty good balance. For the rest of the parts here, the woodwind parts look very intimidating, but we're in a fast 3/4, so they're kind of phrase marked into kind of almost like a 3/4 waltz-ish style. So just really practice those runs. They're not terribly hard, and once you really get them going, they sound really good with the rest of the texture and not out of place. On this Forte Piano here, once again, really over accentuate that. Make sure like you really are driving and bring that out. Don't rush that 6/8 after letter H. I know the tendency is going to be that we're in a 3/4, we're going to speed up a little bit, but really make sure that you've always got that 8th note pulsating throughout your head. Now, on this measure 85, these 3 8th notes, if you want to put a little bit more spacing between each of them and like kind of give it like a cue-like effect, that's fine, as long as everybody's playing with the same level of intensity and energy across the board and everybody agrees on the note length. You don't want anybody slightly hanging off or starting too soon either. And really use this fermata to really let the sound of the whole band kind of die out in the performance venue before you start on measure 86. So let's listen to measure 86 through about measure 97. Alright, only comments I have for this section is this is a Marimba Solo, so conductor, really lock in with your marimba player. Allow them to kind of bring out, they kind of do set the tempo and the redriving forward after we've been in this slightly little slower section with that 12/8 bar. The glockenspiel should really be able to ring out here. Haha, very funny. That was the previous horn motive notes, so they are a very important idea. So let's listen to, this is measure 98 through 121. Okay, so in this section, the really only comments I have for it is making sure that the brass fall, the dynamic phrasing is very important here. They have to have a very nice, warm sound. We've come from a very harsh place, and now we're contrasting that harsh section with a really kind of lush section of the piece. These woodwind legato ostinato patterns up here, really watch the phrasing and the sort of markings. Those 2 8th notes right there, that 6/8, I've heard that catch up more groups than I can count at this point. So really making sure that you are playing, 1 2 3 reemphasize, 1 2 3 reemphasize, and also once again follow the dynamic phrasing, very important. So let's go ahead and listen to this next section. One sec here, my notes are getting in my way. So this is measures. Let's start at measure 122 here. So flutes and bells bring a nice and warm balance down here. You guys have the main melody. When the oboes, alto saxons, and horn come in, it shouldn't be the dominant idea, but it should be well balanced up there with the woodwinds. Clarinets have a nice supporting breath structure throughout the singing. You guys have a lot of long phrases. None of this is slurred, so use a nice legato sound throughout the piece. Okay, so let's do 138 to 148. Okay, so a couple comments on this section here. Anytime that the brass have anything like this idea where you have a quarter note crescendoed into an eighth note accented, really over accentuate that. The Purdue Symphonic Band does an excellent job demonstrating how I want that played, so that's how I would like that done every time. Horns, you kind of have this counter melody too, very important. You keep crescendoing into mezzo fortes. Just think of it as like a reset. Your mezzo forte, you're crescendoing up to maybe like a forte minus or something like that, and then resetting. So it kind of keeps this cyclical building nature throughout. So let's listen to 149 to 164. Okay, so same comment as before. Anytime that you have this quarter note with a pianissimo crescendoing into a forte eighth note, same idea. The way that Purdue does it in this section is beautiful. Over accentuate that every time. For this section, really allow that to drive forward and build up. We're kind of getting into another loud moment, but it's going to immediately be back down. For this whole section, your timpani and your bass drum have to be metrically lined up dang near perfectly. They have identical rhythms throughout the entirety of the section, so it's really easy for them to kind of get off and not recover. So let's listen to, this is measure 165 to measure 173. Okay, only comment here, make sure your oboes and flutes are well tuned together beforehand. The tambourine is very important as well. All of them should be metrically lined up here, otherwise they'll just kind of sound off. Bass clarinets and alto saxes can back off on it a little bit. So let's listen to number 174 through 181. Okay, so in this section we kind of have it's another kind of a big hit moment. Lots of break drum here. Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. I love break drum, and the break drum is just fantastic. But especially when you've got these punctuated hits with some of the brass players here, making sure that's also lined up is really important. The horns and alto saxes kind of have the melody here, but they're not actually the important idea. The important idea is actually anybody who has 2 eighth notes followed by some rests, then 2 more eighth notes followed by 2 eighth notes. And this kind of descending chromatic line right here, it kind of sounds a little jazzy-ish. That's also the important idea. The main motive in the alto saxes and horns, not as important here. So make sure that they're kind of buried a little bit behind everything else. So some precursory information on this next section. We're coming from a place with lots of energy, and we're going to a place with little to no energy, so it's really important to keep that energy drive going, but with a much, much softer volume. So think of it as more like a pulsating drive. So this is 182 through 197. Okay. Only comments for this section is making sure that we do have this pulsating thing kind of going on the marimba, that is what your driving factor is. Don't let the brass here get too loud. Keep them down there at a nice mezzo piano sound, but still very supportive and not too airy. We're looking for that warm sound going into this key change. So this is 198 to 205. Okay, only thing to watch out here is we are going into A flat major. There's not only a key change, but there's a heck of a lot more meter changes. Just as long as you're keeping the eighth note pulse, you'll be fine. You'll be able to make it through the section, no problem. So let's listen to letter U and letter V. Okay, so only comments really for this section here is watch out for we key change one more time to from A flat to C major. So make sure you look out for that. During this build-up section where you kind of have this woodwind ostinato pattern here from letter U to letter V, you can allow that to organically grow because as more woodwinds are added, it's just going to naturally get louder. So make sure that you watch the final dynamic that they end up at right before letter V so that it doesn't peak too soon. Same with the brass. They have a lot of supporting long notes below them that provide the chord structure and the balance of the piece. Make sure that they're not getting too loud too fast, especially once they transition over to letter 214, number 214. Do not let them get too loud there, but allow them to continue basically the momentum that they've started to build up back at 206. It should essentially continue on through measure 221. So let's listen to measure 222 through 237. Okay, so nothing really important here to note besides just continuing to letting the piece kind of naturally build up here. You don't want to force anything like people start playing louder. As more instruments come in and more ideas are interchanged, the piece should just naturally grow on its own volume. There is no real need to say, change your dynamics unless it's specifically noted that you need a crescendo somewhere to slightly bring out an idea. That's about it. So now we're going into the last key change where we go all of a sudden back to C minor. Okay, so this is where we kind of have the final big build-up moment before we start hitting the end of the piece. The euphoniums and tubas have the motive of the piece, but they're not the important idea. The important idea is actually in the flutes, oboes, alto saxes, and tenor saxes and clarinets. This is a new idea that hasn't been heard before, so this should really be brought out. Trumpets need to be very supporting here, along with the first horn. They have this kind of interesting chord structure. These chords actually happen to be the last four chords of the building up into the finale of the piece. So this is my first chance to introduce them. So they are kind of important and they will be revisited at a later point. So let's go ahead and listen to the reprisal section of 248 through 249. Okay, so we have a complete reprisal section of the earlier statements of with the epic horns. This is where horns you can absolutely go just hard, just make Mahler proud, and just really, really bring this part out right here. This is the most important idea ever, and produced performance of this is just phenomenal. That's exactly the kind of level of energy you want in your horn section. They have great tone, but they are loud and dominant over the rest of the texture. Exactly how it should be. Trumpets really punch these notes right here on measure 250 and 251. They are very, very crunchy, and they're going to sound very, very awkward. That's fine. That's how they're supposed to be. So the good news is we are done with 6/8. There is no more 6/8 for the rest of the piece. We are now strictly in 3/4/4/4. So you've made it out of the hardest section, and now we're into the finale of the piece. So let's go ahead and listen to 262 through 271. Okay, for this section, horns, just absolutely let it rip. Just take the restrictions off them and just let them completely rip these notes completely. So really overemphasize the forte piano crescendo into the fortissimos. Make them as big and as dynamic as possible and contrasting. So there should be a huge ending with a very loud but then suddenly quiet start. Especially on these marcato notes, make sure that you all agree on the note length of the marcatos. If you don't have a slur, try to... It's a slurred into marcatoed, but it shouldn't be re-emphasized except for the shortness of it. It will naturally get re-emphasized through the fortissimo and the crescendos. Also, really let the brake drum, let that rip too. You should be using, at this point, a really hard hammer, nothing plastic. If you have to make a dent in the brake drum, I mean, then you're playing it correctly. And let's go ahead and listen to 272 to 280. Alright, I'm going to stop it right there before the big hype of the end. So this is your chance to really build up the last of the energy and the last of the volume of the piece, and you're building towards your final volume, which should be about as loud as your band can comfortably play. So really let that energy drive through. Don't let the tempo get out of hand, and don't rush it. I've heard some groups try to put a slight accelerando on the ending of this piece. Don't do it. It's going to be the tendency for you to do it, but it's going to make these woodwind parts a lot more muddied than what they are right now. Let it just go as is. So let's just go ahead and listen to the ending of the piece. Okay, so this glissando right here on measure 280 to 281, that needs to be as big and as massive as you can muster out of your brass section. It needs to be absolutely huge. And the resolving chord that it lands on, you need to make sure that's really well balanced, especially going into this final section where we have this open major C chord in perfect fifths and horns. I've written a lot of really cool sections for you guys over my composing career. These 4 measures might be my favorite 4 measures I've ever written for horn. It is completely epic. This is all about you guys. You guys are the star of the show here. Dominate everybody. You are at triple forte. The people behind you should go slightly deaf. Trumpets, you have a triple forte D. You can hit that, fine. And then we're going to blow the whole piece out by this last note should be as loud as your band can possibly play while still having a great sound. Pushing a little bit on brash because it is kind of sparking out of control is what I was going for. So keep that in mind. And that about wraps up all the notes I have for this piece. So quick little summary. Make sure your tempo is consistent. Keep the volume under control until the end of the piece. Don't let the hype build up too fast. Let your horns go as epic as they want during the ending. And most importantly, just have fun playing the piece. If you're having fun playing the piece and conducting the piece, your audience is going to get such a phenomenal performance. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching this episode of Composer Notes, and I will see you all on the next one.